Well, good evening.
Good evening.
And welcome to the Slavery Era Churches of Lexington, Law and Politics of the Past, Present, and Future lecture by Brother Amos Jones, hosted here at the historic Main Street Baptist Church. So we are so glad to welcome you all here to Main Street. So welcome. And we will begin this evening with the scripture. And followed by the scripture, we'll have prayer by our senior pastor, Pastor Victor Scholar. If you have your Bibles on your phones or in your hands, feel free to turn to your Bibles with me. I'll be reading from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 16. I'll be reading verses 15 through 19. I'll be reading from the English Standard Version of the Bible, so please follow along in your copy of God's Word. And the scripture reads, "He said to them, 'But who do you say that I am?' And Simon Peter replied, 'You are the Christ, the Son of the living God.' And Jesus answered him, 'Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven.'" May the Lord add a blessing to the reading and the hearing of his holy word.
Let's pray. Father, we bless you. We thank you for tonight. We ask that you would bless our presenter. We thank you for granting him safe passage here tonight. Lord, we're encouraged. We know that you are the God of history. You're the God that providentially governs, designs, orchestrates your eternal plan. There's not one event or subject matter under heaven that does not involve your hand. And so, Father, we pray that you would give us attentive hearts and minds, and again, bless our time together tonight. We thank you. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Good evening. My name is Bob Brown. I'm on the staff of our Pastor Victor Scholar here at Main Street Baptist Church. I am privileged to have been tasked to welcome you to this very timely lecture on slave era churches in Fayette County, given by attorney Amos N. Jones. His proud parents are here to my left, Pastor Lamont Jones and Sister Kay Jones. So raise your hand. And his siblings as well as other family members. Let us recognize them. We also are pleased that there are state government officials present, and we do honor and recognize you. Our city, local government officials are in attendance as well, and we thank God for your presence. Again, we welcome you and thank you for your presence and support.
it to be fully available. Probably.
Master of Music, Brother Marion Rogers, and our praise team choir for those excellent selections. At this time, I would like to introduce our guest lecturer. I believe the timing of Attorney Jones's lecture is perfect in that our church is in a crisis as a result of the expansion of the Lexington Center and the development of Town Branch Commons Park. We thank you for signing our petition, and those who have not had an opportunity, we hope you will before leaving, for supporting us in our efforts to ensure that we have adequate parking here to continue worshiping God at this location. Attorney Amos N. Jones is a native of Lexington and returns to his home state frequently to lecture and to consult in the area of constitutional law, civil rights, and African American heritage. He is a 1996 graduate of Paul Laurence Dunbar, earning the Commonwealth Diploma, was a National Merit Scholar, and received the Harvard Book Award. He went on to Emory University, graduating as a 2000 cum laude graduate in political science with a minor in African American studies. He has been a journalist with the Charlotte Observer and the Lexington Herald Leader. He earned a master's in journalism from Columbia University. Most notable, in 2006, he graduated from the Harvard Law School and went on to study comparative constitutional law at Australia's prestigious University of Melbourne. Attorney Jones has practiced law in Washington, D.C. for a decade. Starting in 2007, his law firm focused on large global firms with international trade concerns. He went on to establish the Amos Jones Law Boutique on K Street, mostly handling anti-discrimination claims. He has held the position of Associate Professor of Law and studied ecclesiastical court as an academic visitor to the Faculty of Law at the University of Oxford. His most exciting writings over the years have materialized at the crossroad of race, religion, rights, and legal reasoning. He has lectured on 4 continents, but when he is needed home in Kentucky, he has been known to drop everything and come home to help us. Just recently lecturing at Campbellsville University, the University of Kentucky Law School, and the Filson's Historical Society of Louisville, Kentucky. As I thought about the significance of this evening and the profound academic accomplishments of this Amos N. Jones, I reflected on a scene in the autobiography of Jane Pittman, where they gave her a baby, and she would look in that baby's eyes and say, "Is you the one?" Meaning, are you the one that will speak truth to power? Are you the one, in the fashion of prophets of old, that will say, "Let justice run down like water, and righteousness like a mighty stream"? Well, Amos, I'm going to stand up here and say, you are the very one.
Oh my. Thank you, Reverend Brown. Thank you for that. Well, now, it's really good to be here, and I thank everybody for coming and for that introduction, and for Reverend Scholar and this congregation for doing your part to stand firm as you've been doing for 155 years. God bless you, and do press on. I want to thank my family for being here. I see, I guess, maybe a cradle member of Main Street, my sister-in-law, Latanya Johnson-Jones. Good to see you. And my niece, her daughter, one of the nieces, and another niece, sisters, brothers. It's so good to see you all. Of course, my parents, Miss Brown. It feels like home. It's kind of odd to be lecturing to people who held you when you were a baby, and to be lecturing to people you held as a baby. But it's a mighty privilege. So thank you for your warmth, your hospitality. I had lunch today with one of your great deacons here, as well as Reverend Brown. And last night I had dinner with a dear friend who's in the house, a great citizen of this city, and a real stalwart for historic preservation. Mr. Joe Graves is here. And you're becoming like family, because every time I come, I went to one of these Lexington events, there is Joe Graves there to support. I recalled recently that he had been the head at one time of the board of the Bluegrass Trust for Historic Preservation. And what an important organization in our city. I can think of no finer steward of our historic sites and raising awareness of them in this town, in this region. I used to belong to the Bluegrass Trust for Historic Preservation. I lived here from 2001 to 2003 when I was at the Herald Leader as a copy editor, between the college and the journalism school degrees. So I love this town. And I know a lot of you do too. This is one of those cities where you can run into people in all parts of the world, from Lexington, who visited this town, who grew up here, black, white, Asian American, whatever. And people love this town. And part of the reason they love it is that we have here some true treasures that still are known mostly inside the club. And that's wonderful, where we can enjoy these treasures that have been bequeathed to us and to be stewards of those. And that's really what this lecture tonight is about. The title is very clear, and I thank our slide person. You don't have to turn just yet, but I'll be making clear when it's time to slide. Now is the time. The title, as you know, is there: The Slavery Era Churches of Lexington, Law and Politics of the Past, Present, and Future. There's a thematic focus that I want to put our brains into, and that is, the next slide, 4 words: inheritance, stewardship, law, and authority. Inheritance, stewardship, law, and authority. Many of you have read that Herald Leader op-ed piece printed on just Monday of last week. Seems so long ago, but it was in print last week. It was published online a few days before that. That article did not materialize out of a vacuum. It came about after I got word and wind, thanks to the hard work of your congregation and others, that there was a beautiful new downtown plan for some revitalization, a beautiful park coming, some rerouting of roads and things. And then I quickly, after learning about that, heard about some of the concerns about encroachment on this space, this land, this parcel, already once slightly reduced through the reach of urban renewal and the construction of the Jefferson Street Viaduct, and now once again, potentially on the cusp of perhaps a more or less constructive discharge. That concerns me. I have been talking about these longtime historical institutions, historical and historic, for years. Now, I'm not that old, but this has been a project of mine for a long time. You can go to the next, just move that up because it's not a PowerPoint. So if you just use the arrow or the page down, we have our, there, you can leave that there for just a moment. And Reverend Brown already told you that there have been some other presentations along these lines. This is a very serious topic that's not new. And some of us have kind of lived into history because when you're doing things that are historic, you're not thinking about it. For instance, the civil rights movement. Nobody said, let's boycott a bus and become famous and have a civil rights museum as martyrs and things in 50 years. They just said, let's fight for justice. And later on, we decided that's history, right? I doubt that Amelia Earhart said, let me be a woman aviator and just the National Organization of Women will be formed one day and I'll be the hottest thing since sliced bread. That's not, she said, let me fly some planes to the best of my ability. And we decided that's history. And I'll take it to the cross. When Paul wrote those letters to that wayward church at Ephesus or the church at Thessalonica, it wasn't, let me write some gospels today. It was, let me get them right.
Yeah.
And then the church came along and said, that's gospel. So we don't always know when we've been living in continuity in history that this is something important to hold on to, not just for heritage and tourism's sake, but also for what we leave our children, frankly, in a faith motif. One of the wonderful things about Judaism is that faith, whether people are practicing Judaism or not as their religion, culturally people will be informed from whence they came. And that history and heritage are guarded. So tonight, you can go to the next one, true to the title, the theme, and the times, and in the context of these earlier contributions, and I know that's small print, but it's just a sampling of some of what I've done in Kentucky and elsewhere in this area. I want to offer some more context, some context to that article further to our theme. And I want to move pretty fast because I would like for persons in the audience to have an opportunity to, it feels like a congregational audience, to have the opportunity to engage a bit too. So I'm going to move pretty quickly. This pattern is going to take this approach. I'm going to do some historical hopscotching. That is to explain some of what the heritage out of which the Main Street Church and some of the other antebellum black churches have come out of historically in this region, this state. Move westward for a moment to Louisville, which has some important historical value in the discussion. I want to relate the sociology of slaves to the church polity that informs what we're doing as well here locally. And then that church polity, I want to relate that to institutional creation and continuity. And then from the institutional creation to a theological articulation. And from a theological articulation to political action. Now it sounds big and fancy, but it's actually just the lived experience of Black Baptist life in Kentucky. That's what it is. And when carried out, I said Black Baptist life in Kentucky, but when carried out amid an honorable white community, it's been a witness that has transformed our home state for the better, while some of our neighbors experienced more serious setbacks. We often don't talk about, we do comparative constitutional law across countries, and I'd like to do some comparative state law sometimes. Why did 16th Street Baptist Church get bombed, but Pleasant Green Baptist Church, where the movement was based in Lexington, didn't? Maybe that has something to do with what I've referred to, at least at Campbellsville, as great moments in white history. You know, maybe there are some good white people who helped not have a big blow up in a church, right? So after we do that historical hopscotching, and you're going to hear some familiar stories and names in that. I'll amplify on the Herald Leader piece. They could print only about 1,000 words. Did a very nice job. Very, very fine people at that paper. I'm going to go a little bit more into detail, some things that didn't make it in for lack of space. And then we'll close with a brief discussion of law and politics. And I'm going to close with a dramatic example that was referred to in that article of a wonderful church that's still thriving, though relocated, but a dramatic decision was made to demolish one of the most distinguished Protestant churches of the last 500 years, I would say, and in black circles, one of the most important black religious institutions in all of American history. Now, I do not have to reinvent the wheel as we start in section 1 with the historical hopscotching. And the reason is I didn't have to do primary research on these churches or on this state because people like the wonderful Dr. Gerald Smith, professor of history at University of Kentucky, who has a wonderful volume, African American Encyclopedia of Kentucky. People like him, Dr. Doris Wilkinson, she's emeritus, I guess, now, over at UK, sociology. These folks have already presented historical facts. All we have to do is figure out what they mean for us now and what they can mean for the future. So let's delve into that a bit. Let's talk a bit about some Black Baptist history. We'll start in Lexington and spread a little bit west. This town has the African American Heritage Trail that was popularized and essentially published by Dr. Wilkinson under the auspices of the Lexington Convention and Visitors Bureau, and it's now essentially a walking tour that's a fine opportunity for visitors to our town and others to come to know of 5 or 6 antebellum black churches of 4 different denominations, in fact. Now, if you know anything about slavery, you'll understand that to have, before the end of the Civil War, gatherings of blacks, slave and free, operating autonomously, which is a part of Baptist polity, autonomous congregations, sovereignty within one sphere, personally first, voluntary baptism, nobody makes your religious decisions for you, and then on to the congregational autonomy, you will vote pretty much on everything all the time. Then there's the convention, usually, or association, and that's sovereign. They can kick people out, or certainly the denomination at large can do that too. Fellowship can be withdrawn. Southern Baptists are probably the most well-known for disfellowshipping congregations. That's sovereignty in the sphere there. That's an important point, because in Protestant history, the notion of sole competency of a priesthood of believers somehow extended into the persons of slaves. So much so that in this part of the country, which is known worldwide as a Baptist stronghold, in Australia, the dean of Whitley College, the Baptist College of Victoria, where I served as a resident tutor, was educated at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, class of 1972, the PhD. Globally, this is a Baptist stronghold. That reality, socio-historically, dropped down into the black community. So people asserted their spiritual independence, organized among themselves, and started churches prior to the Civil War. And if you want to read about them in their individual histories, I invite you to, for a quick history, just read about the African American Heritage Trail in this town. Your congregation, Main Street, falls into the picture as a product of a withdrawal of about 500 members from First Baptist Church, as it was called then. Now it's First African Baptist. And the roots of that church go back. That church most closely associated with London Farrell, who really built it out after about 1822. And then there are others, East 2nd Street Christian Church, one of the oldest Disciples of Christ congregations. One of the oldest black ones in town at 1851, well before the Civil War, well in slavery. You can go back to 1838, thereabouts, Wesley United Methodist Church. That's a third denomination. And then 1820, St. Paul AME Church. Before it was part of the AME Church, it was functioning as a congregation with Methodist theology, and it dates to 1820. Their building the oldest part of which dates to 1826, has been regarded as the oldest existing house of worship of any denomination, faith, color in this town, St. Paul. And it's on North Upper Street. Many of you, I'm sure, have been there. You can enjoy their beautiful stained glass windows, and I'm told you can visit where slaves were hidden behind the chancel area for the Underground Railroad safe passage to the north, and in some cases on to Canada, right here in Lexington. So that's why there's an African American Heritage Trail. I would suggest to you that this establishment of these institutions like yours speaks volumes about a kind of faith cooperation that was interracial. There were other parts, some parts of the state, other parts of the South, where blacks had to have a white person present if they were to gather in any number, maybe more than 3. Not so much here. You also might be familiar with the post-bellum churches. They're innumerable. That was easy. You know, after the Civil War, a lot of white congregations set up independent black churches on purpose, especially in the South. The bitterness, but also the view that there's freedom now, there's more political autonomy along with the spiritual autonomy that these blacks have engaged for a long time, and so let's give it a go. And they did. So a whole lot of churches were founded after the Civil War. But we stand in a special place here in Lexington because it happened beforehand. I believe that it was a period of perhaps a healthy competitive ferment. If you are in an environment where people are doing exciting things, you tend to start doing exciting things. And I think that the energy, the energetic fervor, especially given that Second Great Awakening, the Stone Campbell revival happened very near here. I think that helped to animate these changes. So we didn't have too many blacks in Kentucky in slavery compared to other states. I think that made the community not such a threat. It enabled the white community to let the black community do what they needed to do, at least in terms of religion, and they did. And here we are. But it was an inspiration across the state, what happened. We had in Louisville churches founded in the 1830s, the 5th Street Baptist Church, and then Green Street Baptist Church in 1844. And so others, Washington Street in Paducah, 1855. First Baptist Georgetown, I think, was 1833. This is unique. In Kentucky, we're used to it. But if you go around the country, these are very, very old churches. It says very much about the way we were. And I guess that's why in 1875, the first meeting of colored Baptists ever to be held in the country was held in Louisville at the Green Street Church. I guess that's why the American Baptist, according to the account that I read, had to go to New York in journalism school to learn this one. I took the history of American journalism with Dr. Andrea Tucker, who'd been a speechwriter for Bill Clinton. And we read about the black press and read in one of the listings that the American Baptist is the oldest continuously operating black newspaper in the country. The American Baptist, I guess it was weekly, but it's a not infrequent publication now that comes in tabloid size and came to our house weekly for growing up when it was weekly. And I didn't know till I left and went to New York that I knew it was old, but I didn't know that it had been that important. It had been the organ of the National Baptist Convention at one point, which was by the 50s the largest organization in the world. And then so the General Association of Baptists, the Black Baptist group in Kentucky, organized very quickly. Lots of instrumental former slaves, some of whom their freedom had been purchased by their congregations. That happened here. I want you to stop and think for a minute on what John Hope Franklin reminded us all of. We think of slavery, and as we should, as a horrible thing, and it was. It was a bit more complicated sometimes than we reduce it to being. We have, if you're my age or younger, the images of Roots and Kunta Kinte in our brains. I wasn't old enough to remember the national fear. I mean, when Roots came out, I'm told by people who were old enough, who were around then, that it was really volatile because there was a lot of whipping and lashes and the name change scene. It was LeVar Burton when I saw it made for TV. But John Hope Franklin reminded us that it wasn't all Kunta Kinte, because most slaves were bondable. They could hire out their services in town and keep the money. We forget that if a congregation is buying its pastor's freedom, which is what happened at Pleasant Green Baptist Church with George Washington Dupee, who went and founded almost 20 black Baptist churches across the state, settling in Paducah after 1855 at the Washington Street Church. How'd they pay for that? They were slaves. Well, somebody was making some horseshoes and giving the money to the church, and the church bought the pastor's freedom. And then they bought the property. Before that, blacks owned property. Whites honored the commitment to manumit the slaves. They cut a deal. Okay, you bring the offering, I'll free him. And they freed Dupee. Dupee was one of the founders of the American Baptist newspaper. He financed it with some of his own money when people thought we didn't need a paper. And of course, you have to be thinking ahead. Why have a paper when most black people couldn't read? But you have to be thinking ahead in preparing for the freedom. And that's been the genius of the Black Baptist Church in Kentucky. So if you fast forward, there's one more thing in more contemporary times we have as we complete this hopscotching. It's the Kentucky Civil Rights Act of 1966. That is still the strongest civil rights act in the South. Now, we'd had hoped it would pass in 64. Dr. King did his March on Frankfurt. When it didn't pass, so he came after 64, and it passed in 66. He called it at the time the strongest civil rights act in the South. It still is. It's, for example, it does things like you can file a discrimination suit against an employer in state court without having to go through an agency first. That's actually a very important protection. A lot of other places you can't just go into court. You have to go through a long period of conciliation. Sometimes I call it the cover-up period. But, not in Kentucky, though. And that's because we have some good political leadership and some people holding people accountable, like the late State Senator Georgia Powers. She's the one that we can credit. She tells the story, one person can make a difference because she was the black woman in the state Senate from Louisville. I guess at the time she might have been the only serving black state senator. The Senate's not that big. There might have been one other at the time, but there she was. And the bill had gone down in 64. It was a biennial legislature every 2 years. Wouldn't that be nice? Every other year, the legislature didn't have to do that much. Everything was running pretty well. They came back in 66. The farmers wanted daylight savings time and lacked one vote. Georgia Powers wanted a civil rights act that was the strongest in the South and lacked a whole lot of votes. They traded. They made a deal, she says. This is the story I've seen on the documentary on the movement in Kentucky on KET. And she said that, I'll vote, I'll help you if you do my civil rights. And they did. Boom, here we are. What does that have to do with the church? Well, Dr. King came. He did a voter registration rally at Green Street Church in Louisville in 67. His brother, A.D. King, was the pastor of Zion in Louisville, as I recall, a large church. And so this is what the churches were about at their best, a minority of churches. I'm not here to suggest, most churches have their hands full, serving the poor, attending to the needs of their kind. But there are some churches that are set apart by virtue of the particular people who happen to have organized themselves as a congregation, who are positioned and equipped to make change. Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery was not a mass church. When Dr. King went there were about 300 members. It was, you might call it hoity-toity, in fact. There was a bunch of folk who in the 1880s thought that the mass church, the Black First Baptist, was just not sophisticated enough. So this crowd of Alabama State University professors said, we're going to organize our own church and get up out of this mess And they did, and it was Reconstruction, so they built their church right across from in a great municipal area, across from one of the great government buildings in Montgomery. It's still there. Fashionable white thoroughfare. And during Reconstruction, there were 300 people, but it was the right 300 people. In order for that movement to begin with the boycott, and Dr. King, by the way, was passed over. First Baptist Church of Chattanooga passed him over, but Dexter Avenue called him at 26. And that's what happens when you're congregationally autonomous, and when you're black, and you're thinking beyond your current situation. Now, I have established that we have these institutions here, not just congregations, but a newspaper. There's a college, Simmons College of Kentucky, which is coming back. It had been one of the great schools. They had a woman teaching law in their law department in the 1890s at Simmons. And so we have that. That's a college for and by blacks. It was just listed as a historically black college and university for the first time. It pre-existed that group because it was so old. It had become a Bible college, but it's now back accredited as being able to serve people more fully. We have the institution that I think was a product of church activity and smart political decisions and coalitions in the form of our Civil Rights Act of 1966. And this was where my article comes in. It's time to amplify a little bit. And what I'll do here in part 2 is to read the rest of the story. Some of this will be a bit familiar, but a lot of it, by the way, this wasn't cut for being controversial. It was just too long. So, but if you lean in, this is a personal narrative part of this. I think as a scholar, we all bring a set of experiences, a particular heritage, a particular set of values to our work. These days we own that, and I own mine. So I'm going to present now the full story behind the op-ed, the fill-in material. I had suggested a headline, and they did a great job. You never know the space. I was a headline writer, so it could be in a rail where you have to have 4 words. And the headline, these are things most readers don't have to think about, but you have to make it fit. You have to make the text fit into the space that the designers allocated for the page. So when I say I suggested something and it didn't make it in, that does not criticize the editors at all. They were outstanding editors. They made no errors. They introduced no errors. In fact, they corrected the spelling of Breckenridge for me in the article, which I was glad about. The headline I suggested was, "Where the planning discussions over monuments, Town Branch Park, and our city's emerging global standing naturally lead." That is where the planning discussions over monuments, Town Branch Park, and our city's emerging global standing naturally lead. It's a forward-looking statement. And it began, "High above the Hudson River, abutting Grant's Tomb, facing America's tallest church, astride Riverside Drive and anchoring the northwest end of America's academic acropolis, in the Manhattan neighborhood of Morningside Heights sits International House, New York. Founded in 1924 by John D. Rockefeller Jr. and the Cleveland H. Dodge family, this private nonprofit institution today houses approximately 700 graduate students and interns at any given time. They come together from more than 100 countries to live in a programmatic community while studying at highly distinguished educational institutions or working for some of the world's most powerful companies. Exchange is the name of the game here. The motto for these women and men is that brotherhood might prevail. Beneficiaries of the stewardship of outstanding presidents and trustees over the years, the 65,000 alumni have served as heads of state, executives of global concerns, agenda-setting journalists, groundbreaking academicians, influential clerical leaders, and more. Past chairs of the board have included 2 former U.S. presidents, 3 former secretaries of state, and a former chairman of the U.S. Federal Reserve. Bullet Lexington's influence. After my year there as a master's student at Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism in 2002 to 2003, I concluded that this was a great intellectual country club, a place of scholastic and moral ferment that supplied the ideal buffer between my 2 years of work at this newspaper, the Herald Leader, and my 3 years of study at the Harvard Law School. A community international house, privileged in the best sense of that word. We have the Civil Rights Act of 1964 because Dexter Avenue was a very privileged church. There's some privilege is good at particular times, especially if you use it the right way. Sorry for the footnote. Back to what I wrote. Some of my most meaningful friendships were begun at iHouse and later within the network of a handful of other similar international houses in Washington, D.C., Melbourne, Australia, and London, England. Let me step aside. One of the reasons these international houses were so important to me, I need to just speak from my position as a black person specifically here. If you sit in a seminar and ask most black Americans who've traveled when they truly felt like an American first, most of them will tell you when they went out of the country. And the reason is other people see you not just as an American first, but as a very authentic kind of American, especially if you're around a bunch of highly educated Europeans, because they think and see cultural indices as dispositive of American greatness. Dunking a basketball. Creating spirituals like we heard Minister of Music Rogers so ably accompany here tonight. They know of, for example, Martin Luther King calling America to become what it espoused on paper in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, the great radical leader who made it unacceptable for serious Protestant pastors not to engage contemporary issues. That was black Americans to them. They also saw jazz and gospel, rap, and now hip hop. But the point is, they see you all. So in these international, I didn't have a whole lot of money to go around the world, but the world came to me at home, at International House. And as a black person, it was a complete awakening. I'm so glad that I did that year in New York, not so much for Columbia, which was great, but for International, it changed everything. So I wanted to make that point in the article, but it came out because of space, which is fine. So as I said, I went around in Melbourne and London too, and Washington, D.C. at iHouses. The other nice thing is, when you go around the world later on, you can go and be shown the real town. Like if somebody came to Lexington, I would obviously show them things different from what you get on a tour bus. So you can go with them and get better oriented because they've lived it and they're not a tour operator, though there's a place for that too. So I'll continue. One of the purposes of education, and the reason it is noteworthily effective undertaken in youth, is to expose the student to various perspectives and to shock the youngster into a self-awareness unavailable without the critical eyes and examinations of others. Interaction with peers from diverse backgrounds, everyone now agrees, is essential in this project. You learn who you are, in part through learning who you are not, and by considering the particular pathways to identity that shape your own personality. And of course, the learner can then choose to develop beyond, some might say, where they were, or double down on where you came from, and reattach to it, or never come unattached, buttress it. Or you can do both, all on the road to forming that which he or she is to become. So at International House, all resident members spent at least some time each day or week in the dining room. That's another thing. Taking meals together, talking about everything going on is a great way, especially in a secure, plush setting, to foment conversation, and the food was very good. So I taught in the article about meeting George Melazza, I found out George this didn't make it into the article, George actually was a revolutionary, I learned. Holly met him, she came to my graduation. And George was a revolutionary in the Rose Revolution. And after that, he sent over the Constitution, the draft Constitution, and another I-House friend and I were able to provide some commentary on the religious liberty provisions that they wanted to have. Everybody copies the United States on liberty. Everybody copies the United States on liberty. And that was important. That's where this Baptist from Kentucky part came in. George had been listening to the radio one day in New York, and a guy said, tongue-in-cheek, if you really want to know the real America, you need to meet a Baptist from Kentucky, you know, not all this New York stuff. It was actually intended to be pejorative. One of my friends in college, a very highbrow Episcopalian, said that Methodists were Baptists who could read. That wasn't very nice. Is that good? Thank you. I'll try to project. There are great acoustics here. I think you all can hear me. So George delved into that, and that's how our conversation got started. I began to think more intentionally about where I come from here in Lexington. Now, I had already done a little bit with the 6 churches here. In 1999, there was a Lexington Convention and Visitors Bureau tourist exhibit. After in Atlanta for college, I went to a church, the church you'll see here in a moment, that really was very proud of its very good history. Very distinguished history, but I didn't understand why they thought they had it going on, because they were founded in 1866. Because I'm from here. What is that? That's not old. What is that? But then I realized, yes, it is. That's very old. And so I thought, well, you know, this is special what we have. So just a small project. It was covered in USA Today in February of 2000, and I'd set it aside. So in the scholarly environment, I came and went deeper. And so the rest of the article flows from there. There's not much that got baked out before that point. But I have to bring it up because we all are on a journey, aren't we? And we all have these moments where we're shocked into self-understanding. Sometimes the revelation comes from where you least expect it. There are only 5 million Georgians. I took him to my uncle's church in Brooklyn one day with a crowd of people. I like to take a crowd of people to church. You kill about 5 birds with 1 stone. And he met my uncle who had preached in Georgia. There aren't that many Georgians. Who would think that you'd get this insight from a Georgian? But you never know. Sometimes it's more challenging. Sometimes you're called to justify or defend your heritage because it's under attack. That's not so pleasant. But if you've been thinking all along and engaging, then the response, as I think Reverend Scholar has demonstrated in the leadership of this church, the response is very clear. I told Reverend Brown, what's wonderful is that you have unity here at this particular moment of challenge, and frankly, a moment of opposition. Having been organized in 1862, and having bought this land in the 1870s is a very serious accomplishment. It's a serious accomplishment because it says, up on this rock we will build, where we have chosen. And you did, and you've been here ever since. That alone, when you are black in Kentucky, is something that ought not be molested. You have some other examples around in terms of things that have happened inside. I mean, I love Pleasant Green Baptist Church, so they're in the article. And all I'll say about them is to just read. They even edited out the last part of the historical marker in the paper. So I'm going to read what the historical marker says over there at Pleasant Green. It says historic land. And this marker went up around the time of the church's bicentennial, 1990. My mother is sitting there, Kay Grimes Jones, and she, helping my older brother Lamont, who's also a Baptist minister, guided the application for this historic marker in the 70s. That's how long it can take. And my brother was in the Kentucky Junior Historical Society while he was a student at Lexington Junior. now LTMS, I guess. And they correct Arlington Elementary. And they wrote up this application to have a historic designation marked. And it says, the marker came in 1990, 2 decades later almost. And it says historic land. It reads, the land upon which Pleasant Green Baptist Church stands was conveyed in 1822 by Dr. Frederick Ridley, a white surgeon in Lexington, to trustees Harry Quills, Benjamin Adman, and Solomon Walker, all slaves. You can't tell me that black people have a problem with inferiority complexes. I don't believe it. Number one, they were always pulling their churches out, calling their own church First Baptist. That's not what people with an inferiority complex do. And then they roll up to the surgeon calling themselves trustees, which they were. It's a Baptist church. They were trustees. Conveyed in 1822 by Dr. Frederick Ridley, a white surgeon in Lexington, to trustees Harry Quills, Benjamin Adman, and Solomon Walker, all slaves, for purpose of erecting an African church. That's all that was in the paper. But it's the next sentence that, to me, on the marker, is a point of great pride religiously, culturally, politically, legally. From date of deed, black congregation has continued to worship at this site. And now it's 195 years. I called after speaking with Reverend Brown the week before last briefly. We talked about the oldest church founded by blacks and for blacks, and it dates to 1773, the First African Baptist Church of Savannah, founded for blacks by blacks. You can go visit that church. They have a historic center. They even have tours. They actually charge for tours. Now that sounds bad, but if you have all these tourists all the time and you have a staff and office dedicated, I can understand why you would have organized tours and perhaps charge, I think it's $7. But I spoke with the officer at the church and I asked them, when did you all start worshiping on the property you're on? And it was 1833. So even though that church is much older than our oldest black church here in Lexington, our church took title to its property a long time earlier. So you see, you're not just in the downtown Lexington with Main Street, with East 2nd Street, with St. Paul, with Pleasant Green. This is not just some property. And I won't even go into the historic events. There are actual historic events that happened inside Pleasant Green and historic people. But it's a great history. That's in the article. Nothing new here on that. But I wanted to point out, this is a global story. Jesse Jackson used to talk about how African Americans, we sometimes see ourselves as so small. When if you're looking objectively at the situation, it's such a great history. And what I love about it is, even when they killed Martin and killed his mother on the Oregon, and even when, the worst, darkest days happened when the 4 girls got bombed in a church, we never retaliated. You won't find at the Main Street Baptist Church a Sunday school class where they teach you how to make suicide vests. Even though I could understand at some point, back in the day, before, how people could get real mad. Martin, I get these clients who come in, with valid discrimination claims. And of course, if I didn't believe them, I wouldn't file suit. And I have to help them understand how things really work and how vigilant you have to be, and how it's only grace that gets you to the victory, because, they think it's like TV, the way I used to think before I started doing this kind of law. They think that justice prevails and victory conquers evil every time. That's not true. These cases get bounced. After I spent all this money, they get bounced, tossed. And I remind them, I'm glad that you're encouraged. I'm encouraged, or I wouldn't be doing this. But Martin Luther King got shot in the face and was dead and left Coretta with those 4 children and no income. So he didn't see his dream actualized. I believe he's looking down. The ultimate reward we know is in heaven. This is a temporary thing, but we have to do our job down here. And the fact of the matter is, it's not so easy. So we've contributed very much and have never retaliated. We have worked hard within the system with petitions, which I'm not a citizen, but I'm going to sign it tonight. I went out market so nobody thinks it's fraud. I live in Washington, but I'm going to sign the petition. We have a lot of power. We bought our own freedom. People bought their children. Now, slavery was horrible. A lot of people got sold down the river. We used to say, till death or distance do us part. If you read the Encyclopedia of Louisville, you'll find that at the Green Street Baptist Church, which is known for piety, that church is known for piety. I think they've had 8 pastors since 1844. They're on number 8, long serving. And they would really disfellowship you in a heartbeat. I mean, you could be disfellowshipped for not speaking to another. It's true, it was in the Encyclopedia of Louisville. Tattling, appearing in court, that was on the list. They would restore you as well if once you took the chair. So we don't even have chairs anymore in our church. I like you to take the chair, accountability. But Reverend, and I watched your sermon from the week before last with my mother and father last night. I like y'all's pastor because he challenges people. Yeah. You got it. I'm just an aside here. I'm a black Baptist. If I've gone to church every Sunday for the last 4 weeks and have not walked out of that sanctuary feeling bad about myself, at least 3 of those Sundays, my pastor has failed in his obligations because we all need correction. Amen. Now, we can take that on. Now, I'm going to approach my closing so we can have some time. I want to leave at least 15 minutes for some discussion, and there may be some other things on the program. So I'll be quick here. I want to talk for a minute about this church in Atlanta. That was good to me. I mentioned the USA Today attention that this Lexington historic church has got in 1999 and 2000. I chose to be photographed at Friendship Baptist Church. Now, my father's little sister's husband was pastor at the time of a much larger church, with historic in its own right, Wheat Street Baptist Church. But I chose Friendship instead of Uncle Mike's church because it was the oldest Black Baptist church and I thought had the most distinguished building. You can take it up. Just one. I don't want to give away. Yeah. There it is, a lovely stucco, sort of Italianate. Reminded me of the buildings at Emory, in fact, which is where I was a student and from which I had been nominated for this USA Today honor that led them to come photograph. So the pastor, William Guy at the time, allowed me to come and be photographed in the church. Organized in 1866, the sign said, they have now found information that suggests that they were formed in 1862. So they have backdated their history. The church that my father served briefly in Owensboro, the 4th Street Baptist Church did that. They had been counting for years 1835. But records apparently materialized that showed it was more 1830 that they became a congregation. So these churches in slavery, you're going to see more of that, where information comes to light in the proliferation of African American studies. There's so much rich material that has not been mined that's in often white libraries. Now, so go on up, please. Now stop. That's lovely Friendship. 1860, that is the church where Spelman College was founded in 1881. And the location where Morehouse College, the Black Baptist School for Men, relocated from Augusta there first, then onto the campus in Southwest. So a great church. It is a very distinguished church in terms of its clergy. At the time, they were on the 5th pastor in 134 years. They serve a long time. And one of them only served 8 years. Maynard Jackson Sr. was a minister. You can go to the next one. Maynard Jackson Sr. was the pastor. You see, that's the 1951, and you can go on up just a little to the bottom where it will show you there. The 85th anniversary program, and sort of like Main Street, again, founded in 1862. If you look at some old pictures of Main Street with that beautiful old building before, you'll see that awful house of ill repute next door that looked like garbage like that, whatever, next to Friendship. And now it's nice because they were going to tear down the Mary Todd Lincoln house too. So it's not personal or racial all the time. Some of you just don't know. They didn't know what they had. That's why I'm not mad about this. People don't know. You just have to tell them. Nobody will say, let's get rid of the black man. I mean, a few people, but that's always one. But the real thing, people don't know. But we do. We have a complete history. So there's Friendship, and that building is no longer there. Now go to the next one. They had a crossroads recently. It was in the article. Lovely interior. And Minister of Music Rogers, they had just expanded their pipe organ, a lovely French-style Cassavant organ. When I was there years ago and took my picture in 2000, those chambers had not been filled out. So they had just improved it 4 years ago when the city decided they wanted to have a new football stadium in order to keep the Falcons. So like I teach them in law school, these decisions are hard decisions because the Falcons were going to move to Cobb County. They were going to move out of the city, and the last thing people wanted, there were probably Falcons fans in the church, the last thing people wanted was to be the cog holding up the wheel of progress. But they held out. They rejected a $13 million offer from the city. They said, they didn't need the money. They do not need a dime in that church. I mean, the way we think of churches that need money, they have a lot of very prosperous members and always have, including Maynard Jackson Sr., who was outstanding, the father of Maynard Jackson, who had been the mayor. So they just, we're not moving anywhere. Go to the next one, please. Okay, so it got up to 20 million and they voted to move. See, then that's I guess the Georgia Dome wasn't nice anymore, y'all. The people in their 20s, if you're in your 20s, see, I'm old enough now where I remember when they built stadiums and then they tore them down. So the Georgia Dome, I think was it 96 when they finished that, right before the Olympics? Who remembers the Georgia Dome? But there it is in the background. It's not good enough anymore. So they're going to move on down, and Friendship Baptist was the holdout, but that 20 million came. Also, look, it's complicated. I'm told the mayor of Atlanta is a young black attorney, probably not that young, but you know, they didn't want to get in his vision, the way of his vision, I think. A black mayor was prevailing on them to do this deal. The other thing is they got a good land swap. They got historic property, at least, on Morris Brown College's campus after a foreclosure. Morris Brown sadly lost some of its land. They're still open and operating as a college, but that was an AME school founded for blacks and by blacks, I think in 1881 thereabouts. So yeah, they went on and sold out on to the next one. Yeah, that fellowship hall that had just gone up when I was there. They couldn't move the church. Sometimes you can move an old building, but not that one. They had done this stucco later. The building dates to a long time ago. Next one, please. Yeah, that's the fellowship hall on now. So sad. Does that have internet connectivity on it?
No.
Okay, no worries. I'm glad I have the pictures. Next, you can go to YouTube and see the video, a 6-minute video of the wrecking crew. On down, please. Yep, there's somebody, they bulldoze tore up the steeple. The tower rather, on down. And now it's gone. You can leave it there. Once it's gone, it's gone. Once it's gone, it's gone. And this is not about architecture, I should say. Don't get it twisted. This is not about they're too attached to their building. No, that's not what. And even if you are, the truth is the building that you all built in the 60s, we never know what's going to be historic next. The way they're building these churches now, that's about to be historic because people don't build churches that look like churches anymore. So that's going to be a perfect classical example of a 1960s era Protestant rebuild. We don't know what's this, so you don't think that way when you're doing it. That's why I call this an emergency lecture as I close. I coined that term here in Lexington this evening because it's a way of a scholar who ordinarily would lecture to other audiences to commit himself to a project of alarming communities and supplying himself or herself as a co-laboring interventionist. We have to join forces, the clergy, the community, the scholars, to avert crises. This is one of religious and cultural significance. And the emergency lecture, and I thank you for inviting me to do this here, is an approach that I hope can gain traction, that other people will adopt or even seek out, because Lexington is not alone in facing these pivotal decisions that call for an informed voting public. And my hat again goes off to your pastor, Reverend Scholar, and this entire congregation for standing up and asserting yourself once again. Nothing new for Main Street. You're here with 3 buildings. I said campus on purpose in that article. Somebody decided, we're here and committed to the city. So you've stood again, and you're standing again in total personhood. And you're doing it in what we call one nation under God. You are deploying the very kind of moral authority that I think African Americans as a people still, some of us, hold to in a way that is frankly unrivaled in the world. And when we do that, in the tradition of people like Dr. King and others, we can move mountains. It is my prayer and my actual projection that having been so engaged, that Lexington will get this one right, and that we never again will be called upon to justify our continuity in these meaningful spaces of witness. I thank you all for thinking with me along these lines this evening and invite you now to engage with questions or concerns.
So if you have a question, just feel free to raise your hand. Armando's going to be on that side of the room. I'll be on this side. And
Okay,
so
thank you.
we'll leave it up to Brother Amos to call on you, and we'll give you the mic.
Yes, sir. Oh, they have a microphone they'll bring. Very good.
My question is that the Christian Baptist, as a historical church, moved to Morris ground, you said, to a historical site. Is that right?
Move on to what they, in fairness to them, I'm glad you said that. Look at what they built. They built on a historic site, and they just dedicated this building a little while ago. So they kept some of the motifs, our architectural elements. So of course the windows will travel. I think the organ is still being rebuilt in the new church. So they moved to a historic site, and got $20 million as well. Which, you know, look, if somebody came in here and offered Main Street $200 million, I mean, you would actually have to think about that. Luckily, that's so hypothetical. It's where you get to the close, that's the, like in law, that's the close stuff is where the law is. That's the hard part. These 5-4 Supreme Court decisions. So yeah, they had a historic site they were relocated to. It's not their site. That's the beauty. I would never interlope in a congregation's decisions. Congregations will make their own decision. That's why I'm at Main Street and so happy that it's very clear to me that you all are very unified. You're unified. There are songs in the hymnal about unity for this reason. Can you imagine if people had really been trying to backstab Dr. King? Doesn't that say something about some people said you could argue that that was a Black Baptist movement. Now it had other folks. Some of you here were in the movement. There were Unitarians, there were whites, there were Jewish folks, there were obviously Episcopalians. One of the best people in this town went on to become Episcopal Bishop, Robert Estill, who was one of the early inductees into the Civil Rights Hall of Fame. He's not going to do it the way Reverend William Augustus Jones did it because he pastors a different congregation. But Robert Estill had the people with power in his pews. And that's one of the reasons that we got to where we got. But it's those close spaces where you have the hard decisions to make. But this church is unified. Next. Yes, sir.
Yeah, what would you say is the most critical issue with respect to a situation like this? What is the most fundamental and critical issue before the people?
In my mind, a situation like this, you can read the petition, where what I think it's a constructive kind of discharge. Without the right amount of parking, you simply cannot operate, I don't even think, in compliance with certain codes. So there's a fundamental legal issue about whether you can continue to operate under the law. So there are several ways to achieve what you need to achieve. The first thing is that people really were aware, the people who make decisions, and they're being made aware now and making commitments I think, to the church. If they were aware, further to that issue, you wouldn't have to go and have a particular result. Sometimes you change the law. London Farrell was pastor of First Baptist here and had not properly left Virginia as a black person. And there was a state law, I think, that required him to be returned in the 1850s. He was so popular among whites and blacks, the legislature passed a law exempting him from the law so he could stay and preach. Now, I was told by Dr. L. Haley McIntyre years ago that he was really Henry Clay's half-brother. It would make sense. Henry Clay's whole brother was pastor of the White First Baptist in Frankfort, even though Henry Clay was Episcopalian. So that would make sense. Many lawyers have brothers who are ministers. And so, it happens all the time. So that's the issue, the law part. Bringing me into this, what is law but politics? They're going to make the ordinance what you tell them to make the ordinance in most cases. And sometimes you can even get unconstitutional laws passed. That's not called for here. But unconstitutional stuff can last a long time. I litigated a case where for 2 years the law of Kentucky was unconstitutional. It completely violated the Constitution by invalidating tenured seminary professors' tenure contracts. Luckily, we took it to the Kentucky Supreme Court on behalf of Dr. Jimmy Kirby, and we won unanimously 7-0 in 2014. We could have just quit, and that's what the law would have been. Unconstitutional. Who's going to challenge it? It's political. Organizing is key. One more quick point. Is there another question before I make a quick point about what you may have to do if law is too slow or you don't see it? In Atlanta, if you drive beyond the Carter Center and Carter Library, President Carter, down the Freedom Parkway, you get to Briarcliff Road, Moreland Avenue, and the road stops, and there's a big empty expanse that goes on and on. That was supposed to be the Presidential Parkway through the Tony Druitt Hills neighborhood, designed by Frederick Olmsted, like Ashland Park. The ordinance was in place and the bulldozers came, but the people got down on the ground and there's no road to this day. This is not China. We don't do Tiananmen. So, don't rule that out. Next. Is there another before? We'll take a second. Yes, sure.
Don't rule it out. In the late 50s, 60s, nonviolent direct action. I mean, I was there. I was in it.
Yes.
Nonviolent direct action works. When you have a just cause, you have to stand up for yourself and let God handle the matter. And that's what we did. There's a difference between our movement and the Black Lives Matter movement and everything. We were church-centered. We were God-centered. And before we left the church, we always had prayer. It was God-centered. When God is on your side, He'll take care of you. You do the right thing, He'll take care of you. But you got to do your part. And sometimes you have to stand. I'm going to be quiet.
Thank you. That's my father. He has that privilege. In that same documentary on KET about 15 years ago, the one in which I saw Georgia Powers talking about how she cut that deal and got us the Civil Rights Act. There's an Audrey Grievous in that documentary too, and they interviewed Dr. Abby Marlott, the professor at UK, white ally. And Audrey Grievous talked about how they'd have the mass meeting, usually at Pleasant Green. And she said sometimes it was just, you couldn't see where it was going to go. And you had to have faith. And she said, and we'd go back and Reverend Jones would pray some more. That's what she said, Reverend Jones would pray some more. And that's what happened. And by the way, nobody was doing it to get a plaque. Lonnie Guinier in her memoir, Lift Every Voice, has an expression, blacks with plaques. Now we have people who want it to be Facebook Live so that they can look like they're in the justice movement. It's vanity. And that's okay if you need, just make them show up when it counts. But there was none of that. And in this town, the media wasn't covering it anyway. So you really had an uphill battle. Because if it's not in the media, people aren't going to be aware. Who's next?
You know, I think you did a great job of explaining how what happened during the civil rights movement impacts what we see today and how we feel about that time today. Looking forward, you kind of see that in many cases. You mentioned here in Atlanta and here also, many historical churches are being kind of bought out or moved and things like that. Looking forward, what do you see as the impact on the next generation? As we look back at Dr. King and those folks, how will the next generation see us as we're being pushed and things like that?
It's a very good question. What will we leave? What statement will we have made? And how will we have inculcated those values in our youth and our children? You know, I'm not sure. I know that when they see things like the brave activity of this congregation over the last few weeks, that lets them know that they're marching in the light of God, as that South African freedom song says. I also believe that we can leave tangible things that bear witness to why we're still here. First African did something great with their old building, which was one of the great church buildings of the state, the education building at Short and DeWeese. There was nothing like it when it was built. Churches used to not have Sunday schools. And they had an original Sunday school in this state. And that building is on the National Register of Historic Places because of some of that. That helps people who come along later to realize not only was there stuff going on, but like a monument pays tribute to the monument person in it itself or thing, also it bears witness to that time period and what was going on when some of these statues and stuff went up, or markers. If you go to the next slide, I'm going to suggest, and I'll be looking into this, you all know where to find me on down. I'm going to suggest that we think about going through perhaps the U.S. Department of the Interior to unite all of these downtown antebellum black churches, and there are 5, one building, Old First Baptist, and 4 extant antebellum black churches in place, and seek to obtain what I mentioned in this article through the United Nations World Heritage Designation, like the San Antonio Missions. If you've been to the Alamo, you were actually at a World Heritage Site. There are only 14 in America. Mammoth Cave is the only one in Kentucky, but we do have one here. That's for archaeological reasons. There are only one criterion of about 13 that an applicant needs to meet in order to qualify. I think our black churches meet, I highlighted the ones and moved them up, the selection criteria, and you can stop when you get to the 4. Stop there, please. Do these churches together, out of everything I told you, all of that history and heritage, and these particular buildings themselves, do they represent a masterpiece of human creative genius? Well, if you're a few slaves buying pastors' freedom and starting black newspapers and building black churches and, doing these types of things, I think that's pretty ingenious. I don't know anywhere else in the world in the last 300, 400 years where this has happened, anything like it. Number 2, is there an important interchange of human values? Well, Dr. Ridgely, the surgeon, understood money. He would sell the land. Then the trustees bought it. Human values, capitalism. You know what? When slaves raised their own money and bought freedom, a lot of these serious capitalists, because remember, only the wealthy whites had slaves in the first place. They respected that industry and thrift. And it showed that people have the right priorities. You're buying your wife out of slavery and your children too, instead of being separated. And that you developed a skill that people will pay for when I let you off the plantation to go downtown and make that money. So yeah, there's an interchange of human values over a span of time within a cultural area of the world, the bluegrass, maybe even town planning and landscape design. Part 3, look, you only have to meet one of these to bear a unique or at least exceptional testimony to a cultural tradition or civilization which is living or which has disappeared.
Yeah.
Number 4, an outstanding example of a type of building, architectural or technological ensemble or landscape which illustrates a significant stage in human history. The nice thing about UNESCO World Heritage designation is it's not going to prevent you from using your building or take ownership or restrict the deeds, as I understand it. But your country does have to nominate you. UNESCO is the United Nations Educational, Social, and Cultural Organization. Most of these sites are in Europe. One more, just a little bit down. I want you to see the other area. I cut out 7 through 10 criteria, but the last criterion is 6. The site has to be directly or tangibly associated with events or living traditions, with ideas or with beliefs, with artistic and literary works of outstanding universal significance, like Reverend Sholar's sermon last Sunday before last. The committee considers that this criterion should preferably be used in conjunction with the others. And Reverend Jones prayed some more. So here we have all of that, and you can go to the final slide. It's no different from the San Antonio mission, starting with the Alamo, that go about 15 miles down the San Antonio River in South Texas, and illustrate these values in a way to call attention. That's what we can leave our children, maybe. Or at the very least, put more of this stuff on the National Register of Historic Places, which is another application process. That's how I know a lot of this stuff, because this is not new. That's why I thank people like Doris Wilkinson and Gerald Smith and others, Spencer's History of Kentucky. I come along and you have this issue, and it equips me to just synthesize some stuff as a theorist, as a critical scholar. Are there more questions, as we're a little beyond 8? Yes. I have to watch that.
Yes, I was wondering, the fact that Abraham Lincoln conveyed the property to the church, would that play a big effect?
I think that the Lincoln connection is not quite that direct, as I understand it, but I will leave someone to comment on that. It's the Todd family. Abraham Lincoln's name is on a document, a deed. It's legitimate, valuable. Is there a church historian here? But that is important as to space and time.
I can speak to it.
Yes.
Okay. The Todd family had an estate sale, and they sold it to a gentleman from Georgetown by the name of George DeGarris. And we bought it from George DeGarris. Now, while the name is actually in the chain of title, we did not purchase the record from Abraham Lincoln.
Mm-hmm. I will say this, though, the presence of the Black Todds, that family of this congregation for years. I went to college, and our editorial cartoonist at my college paper was Jonathan Todd. And his uncle he had been Muslim. He was Baptist, family name Todd, then became Tariq Shakur, and then came back to the Baptist church and kept the name Tariq Shakur. But he was a Todd, and they were from Main Street. Their ancestors were out of this church. So if there's a relation there, that's also significant to the Todd family itself, though Mary Todd Lincoln is not Abraham Lincoln in that respect. So the important thing here is that you, in the 1870s, bought the property, that there is some connection to Lincoln, and that you developed it and held it. Don't forget what happened after 1904. It's not just that you were thinking toward the future when you came to this land, but there was a dark age in black history in terms of our legal position. And in Kentucky, it was after the Day Law was passed. You stayed down here in very dark Jim Crow days from 1904 to I would say about 1966, when formal liberty reappeared in Kentucky with the Civil Rights Act in 64, nationally, fair housing in 68. But you continued in the face of really, I think, some hostility that must have been in your way at some level. So that's important too. Good. Any more? And I appreciate this question because I'm a legal scholar, but I'm just a scholar as well, so I can comment on a lot of things. You all have been disciplined tonight. I think that's all. So I will take my seat, and thank you for your attention and forbearance on time. Thanks again.